Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the Politics and IR School of Queen Mary University and the Center for Research on Latin America and Caribbean for the opportunity to present my work for this audience. I would like especially to thank Professor Felipe Antunes de Oliveira for the initiative to organize this book launch and promote this academic exchange between Brazilian and UK scholars. And also, I thank Brazilian colleagues and friends for attending this meeting. I'm delighted to present the most important results of my research in the open dialogues and bridges with South and North epistemic communities. My presentation will focus on the main points and ideas of my book published by Brill. The book contains my analysis of Brazilian bourgeoisie interest in the foreign policy over the last 30 years, during the neoliberalism phase. My PhD thesis focused on Cardoso and Lula's administration. I had finished that in 2014, and then I published a book in Portuguese in 2015. Since then, I have been developing, researching, and master's supervision in further governments, Dilma, Temer, and Bolsonaro. It corresponds to the afterwards in the Brill publisher book that I will focus on my presentation. I will not take too long explaining because I think everybody will be excited to talk about Lula's 3.0 foreign policy challenges. And I will be happy to listen to your reactions to my presentation. As you can see, English is not my first language. So if you can't understand anything, feel comfortable asking me to repeat anything. I will start saying that my theoretical perspective is based on Pulantzas's Marxist thought, the theory of the state and social class. It means that foreign policy is seen as state politics driven by the power bloc. That's a contrast with the realist approach on the international relations studies, mainly the monolithic thesis of the state and the concept of national interest restricted to the raison d'etat, sovereign, and power. It's important to highlight that for Pulantzas, the state is not just a machine for the ruling class interest. It has a relative autonomy. Bureaucratism plays an important role, making a necessary real presence of the ruling class into the state apparatus and keeping the appearance of the general interest representation of the state. For this reason, to play the political game, and in order to maintain the capitalist mode of production, the state can accede to some popular class demands in the name of the unstable equilibrium of compromises. At the same time, the states organize the power bloc, that is a contradictory unit of class fraction with the hegemony of one of them, who controls the state policy, economic, social, and foreign policy. The power bloc is related to the divisions inside the ruling class. These divisions are linked to the size, function, and source of capital. It depends on the political, economical, and ideological determinants. The social class are not just determined by the economical position. It depends on political ideology spheres on the contest. The agglutination of fractions is not permanent. They can be affected by the international and national social and political dynamics. Regarding the international perspective, and especially for dependent social formations, Pulantzas pointed that it's possible to find three kinds of bourgeoisie: national bourgeoisie, internal bourgeoisie, and associated or purchasing bourgeoisie. The associated or purchasing bourgeoisie is dependent on the foreign market, and its behavior reproduces the imperialist interests inside the national social formation. The national bourgeoisie is the fraction whose production and accumulation are directed to the national market, and it needs protection from foreign products. They can join an alliance with the popular class in the name of an anti-imperialist project. The internal bourgeoisie is linked to the process of the internationalization of production and the construction of the global value chains. This fraction is dependent on technology and finance for foreign capital, but at the same time, it needs to compete with them to survive. It is an intermediary fraction between the associated and national bourgeoisie. It has a political ideological fragility due to imperialism, but it claims state protection and some conflicts with imperialism. From these ideas, I proposed that the foreign policy can oscillate between passive subordination to imperialism, anti-imperialism, and conflictive subordination to imperialism. It is related to the hegemonic class fraction on power block. If the hegemonic class fraction is the associated bourgeoisie, the foreign policy will be passive subordination to imperialism. If the hegemonic class fraction is the national bourgeoisie, the foreign policy will be anti-imperialist. If the hegemonic class fraction is the internal bourgeoisie, the foreign policy will be conflictive subordination to imperialism. Using this framework, the central hypothesis of my book is that power block has been suffering a pendulum in these 30 years. The hegemonic class fraction oscillates between associated bourgeoisie and internal bourgeoisie. And by consequence, the foreign policy changed to the passive subordination to the conflictive subordination to imperialism. These positions were linked, respectively, to the neoliberal program in the 90s and after the coup d'etat in 2016, during Temer's and Bolsonaro administrations. In the Neodevelopmentalist program, during works party governments between 2003 and 2016, Lula's and Dilma's administrations. During Cardoso's administration, the foreign policy goal was to find the credibility of Brazilian image and the adoption of IMF rules. The autonomy of participation guided the international regime's acceptance, especially on disarmament, nuclear treaty of non-proliferation, human rights, and environment. It was a passive subordination to imperialism. At first and second Lula's administration, the conflictive subordination was concerned as an increase of margin of maneuver of the state in relation to imperialism as a consequence of the focus on South-South relations, regional integration, South-South coalitions, BRICS, G20, and etc. The main important agenda was to archive the FTAA and the Alcântara Bases Protocol, to freeze Mercosur and the European Union negotiations, to build the G20 at the WTO, to strengthen the Mercosur, and to create UNASUR, plus all the initiatives on South-South cooperation and coalitions with Africa, Middle East, and Latin American countries. Regional integration has moved from the open regionalism strategy to the multidimensional strategy. Instead of focusing just on commercial issues, it had incorporated the social and political agenda. In this sense, the internal bourgeoisie, integrated by manufacturing sector, banks, big engineer companies, agribusiness, and some multinationals as automobile sector, has benefited from specific policies, some of them the selective protection of national market with national purchase policy, social and national development bank strategies, local content policy, and etc. The export market expansion and the opening of international territories to the Brazilian big companies, the increase of the Brazilian foreign direct investment. It changed the unilateral open liberalization and the false search for international credibility of the 90s in the recent period. As Armando Boito pointed, that was a Neodevelopmentalist program, which corresponds to the reform of neoliberalism and has displaced the power of financial capital and the associated bourgeoisie on the power block. This program was supported by the popular class and directed by internal bourgeoisie. Both framed the Neodevelopmentalist Front, an unstable front. It was not an alliance between classes, just a convergence of interests led by the state. In my view, Dilma's foreign policy strategy was the same as Lula's government, South-South relations and sporadic conflicts with imperialism. It can be seen with the strengthening of Mercosur and UNASUR, the creation of Neodevelopmental Bank of BRICS, and the Brazil-US conflicts under espionage scandal. But the economic results were not the same. And by consequence, the Brazilian international state projection started to decay. The question is, what happened to the return of passive subordination to imperialism after the coup d'etat in 2016? Firstly, Dilma's government had suffered the impact of international contest and the national political crisis. I state that Dilma's government tried to dig deeper into the Neodevelopmentalist program and the South-South foreign policy. It was the diminishing of the interest rate and the spread of national banks, and also the strengthening of national market protection. It all provoked the neoliberal front, the oppositional class group, integrated by the associated bourgeoisie, imperialism, and high middle class. They started an offensive that resulted in a political crisis, bringing the internal bourgeoisie to their sphere. The political crisis has been generated by three elements. The impact of the 2008 financial crisis on South America, the new role of China in the international political economy and the conflicts between China and the US, and three, the offensive of imperialism to the pink tide governments in South America. In Brazil, it has been the car wash operation, a lawfare or geopolitical use of the judiciary. Using the anti-corruption flag, they attacked the Workers' Party and leftist organizations. It had been used for Dilma's impeachment and for Lula's arrest in 2018. And it has also destroyed the big Brazilian engineer companies. The change in the oil extraction rules, as the press-out, was one of the main reasons for the imperialist support for the Brazilian coup d'etat, and also the role of the Brazilian state in South-South strategy, South America with regional integration, and globally with BRICS. For this reason, the US coordinated the car wash operation. The financial crisis and the new role of China has impacted the Brazilian exports to Argentina and the GDP. It has increased the social conflicts in Brazil. The internal bourgeoisie starts to be against distributive politics, especially the minimum wage increase policy and the state expenditure on social area. With that, this fraction was attracted by the neoliberal front. The social class alliance starts to work toward the neoliberalism reforms agenda, outsourcing, social security reform, and etc. And they look to a Brazilian international insertion similar to Asia or Mexico, being transformed into maquiladoras and in an export-led economy. In the foreign policy, a decisive moment for the Brazilian political crisis was the coup d'etat in Paraguay in 2012, when the Mercosur decided to suspend this state from the bloc and to admit the Venezuelan state. The Brazilian bourgeoisie does not accept the anti-imperialist Venezuelan discourse and political position. They were afraid it could contaminate the external agenda of the bloc. For them, the regional integration projection is to protect the regional market without breaking up with imperialism and foreign capital investors. Also, the mega regional agreements that the US has started to negotiate in order to compete with China, TISA, TPP, and transatlantic agreements, caused the isolationist fear in the Brazilian internal bourgeoisie. They started to look for a new strategy. After the coup d'etat in 2016, the new agenda of Brazilian foreign policy at Temer's and Bolsonaro administration was: 1. The return to open regionalism and the war against Venezuela state. 2. The acceleration of Brazil of Mercosur European Union agreement negotiation. 3. The membership application for OECD. 4. The abandonment of South-South cooperation, Africa-Brazilian relations, and so on. And 5. The approximation to the US. During Temer's government, the Alcântara Bases Agreement was back on the table, and the new role of Brazilian state in South America starts, with the UNASUR abandonment and the change of position due to the pink-tide governments. The decay of Brazilian state in the international arena was linked to the neoliberal agenda and the increase of Brazilian dependence on foreign capital. It was the return of the associated bourgeoisie on the power block, and the internal bourgeoisie became secondary, joined this program looking to the neoliberal reforms. During Bolsonaro's administration, passive subordination to imperialism became explicit, with a high ideological perspective. The Trump-Bolsonaro alliance has been driven by the anti-globalism agenda. They were against multilateralism, human rights, sustainability, and etc. We can consider that this foreign policy has a neo-fascist character. The high middle class was the social force of the neo-fascist movement in Brazil, giving support for Bolsonarism, especially the subordination to imperialism. Americanism as meritocracy is part of the ideology of this social sector. And the associated bourgeoisie, especially the financial and foreign capital, has benefited from the neoliberal program. The huge difference between Cardoso and Bolsonaro administration was the anti-globalist agenda. The first one worked for Brazilian participation and led uncritical assimilation to the international regimes on human rights, environmental, and disarmament. Bolsonaro acted in opposition to this. However, both were following US strategies and demands in order to get credibility and attract foreign capital investment on privatizations and finance. The Bolsonaro government could be divided in two moments, the first 2 years and the last two. In the beginning, the Trump's alliance drove the foreign policy, including the obscurantism and anti-China or anti-communism position during COVID emergency. But after 2021, with the Biden presidency in the US, Bolsonaro starts a clash with the US and also with the European Union. It involved environmental policy, human rights, and democracy issues. The achievements of the foreign policy were not as expected. The Brazilian state did not access the OECD membership, and the Mercosur European Union agreement was frozen. And also, the regional context has changed with many elections in Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, and Colombia. This could explain Lula's election last year. At this point, I will end my explanation. I hope you all enjoyed it. I would like to say thanks again for this opportunity. I want to listen to your question. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. So one thing that I really find amazing about the style of foreign policy analysis that Tatiana does is how rich the social conditions for foreign policy are in her narrative, right? So I really think that Tatiana and this school that uses Polanzas for the analysis of foreign policy, they are really doing the most brilliant analysis of foreign policy from the perspective of social classes. So how social conflicts within countries determine foreign policy. So thank you so much, Tatiana. It was really, really great to hear that. And that should be useful not only for people thinking about Brazilian foreign policy, but also people thinking about theories on how to study foreign policy in general. So I have two questions for you, and then we'll open for questions if anyone else have questions. So I will start with two questions that exactly touch on these things that I was talking about. So on social classes and foreign policy, and then one question more specifically about Lula 3.0 or the new Lula administration. So as we just saw in this presentation, and as you can see in Tatiana's articles in Latin American Perspectives, and I bet in the book as well, I haven't read the book, but I'm really looking forward to it. The direction of explanation there is from social conflicts in Brazil to international conflicts. So you explain Brazilian foreign policy based on social relations in Brazil. And that is all fine, and Tatiana does it in a lot of detail, so this is particularly interesting. But this is really, I wouldn't say this is not actually an international theory, if you like, and I hope I'm not being too controversial by saying this. And I'm also stealing the line here of a well-known professor that Pedro can identify. I'm stealing a little bit the line here of Justin Rosenberg, and I'm puzzled by where the international is in this narrative, in the sense that you have social conflict and social relations determining the foreign policy, but do you have any mechanism of feedback loop. So how do you conceptualize the international pressures determining social conflicts in Brazil and determining Brazilian foreign policy as well? So I think from a higher theoretical perspective, my question is, can we make an international theory out of Polanza's social theory? How do you transform that from being a simple theory of social relations determining foreign policy to a full international theory that takes into account international pressures as well, and not just take them as the result of social relations? I hope that wasn't too abstract. I can see that Pedro is nodding as if he understood it. I can see Tatiana is nodding as if he understood it. I hope it makes sense to the rest of our audience, because it is a bit of a esoteric kind of debate on IR theory. But I think if I had to put it in like in a nutshell, I would say, is Polanyi's social theory an international theory? Yes or no, and why? And how do you compare this theory to other international theories?
Okay. Can I start?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Felipe. This is a very great question, especially if we read your thesis, we can understand how deeply is your question, I think, and it's a good point. I think that firstly, Poulantzas had developed the Lenin thesis of imperialism, and it can be used for international relation studies. Following Bob Jessup studies, I translated a text. Bob Jessup wrote Poulantzas on imperialism, and he systematized all the Poulantzas tests about imperialism, especially on fascism and dictatorship and social class in contemporary capitalism and so on. And Jessup pointed that Poulantzas had developed three forms of the imperialism: the theoretical one, the theoretical point, the historical, and the contemporary reflections. In the theoretical, I think that Poulantzas treated imperialism as a chain. And this idea is to focus on analysis of inter-imperialist contradictions among metropolis. That was the point. Poulantzas read the dependence theory and tried to use it to think the relations between metropolis, between the dominated states and social formations. And he sees it as a chain. So it's not something that you can just think, oh, let's go to analyze the power block and just see it as a national issue. No, you have the connections, links, nodes, and many contradictions that goes to explain this. I think I pointed in my thesis when I debate with Morgenthau, I used the Poulantzas state concept to this, that the international relations are the connections between power block. So I think that's not to analyze just the internal aspect, but how, if you have a change in the US power block, how it will affect Brazil. So that's the point. Power blocks not just national, especially when we are talking about dependent social formation. You have the external capital acting inside the power block. And you have always these connections between the local bourgeoisie and the external interests and the international pressures and so on. If I would make a provocation, I could say that Cardoso's and Faloto's has been reading Poulantzas to present the theoretical statement in the development and the dependence essay, because they use the idea of international pressure state and social class, and how we will see it as an interconnected material. So we cannot look without considering all of that. I think you have aggregated a lot to highlight the international crisis and how does it work for the changes in Brazil and Argentina, and it's good. I think I didn't put a lot of attention in my book uh, for Lula's and Cardoso's, but at Dilma's, as you could see, I was managed to incorporate the international pressures and the international context to think how does it operate in the Brazilian crisis. So I think that, first of all, Pulantzas has a theory of international studies. It's not all systematized, and as you can see, he's just focused on it. He didn't explain how to use the power block to analyze foreign policy. It's what I have done. He never said something about war and for specific for foreign policy. He was just putting attention on that. If you could read The Crisis of Dictatorship, one of the small books of Polanski, but the great ones, he will say that the regimes change in those social formations had been impacted by the international context, especially the international crisis on 17th, and the European Economic Community creation. How does it operate to change the power block and the regime? So I think we have this, and you can find this in this analysis. But it's important to highlight that Marxism is an integrated analysis from the social class and the international. We cannot analyze the British or Brazilian politics nowadays without considering the foreign policy and the international context. And we cannot make foreign policy analysis without considering the social class dynamics. So I think we need to do this. Sometimes I make many dialogues and debates with the just politics analysis and sociologists, because they need this. They are realizing how important it is in the globalization era of neoliberalism phase to think about international perspective and to link it. So I think we can put these terms. And just to say something more about Pulantzas, I think he was presented some very special questions to against the globalization thesis. As he died early, but he pointed that the state will not change. The whole of the state will be the same, even if the internationalization of production, of the regionalisms in Europe and so on, he pointed, the role of the state will be the same. What will be changed if we have a different phase of the imperialism, a different kind of connections between the links, the nodes, the economic process, and so on. And he said, oh, we will have a new class fraction. That's what changed. The class fractions will change, and the role as the state for that, how the state will organize the foreign direct investment, export and they receive, how it will happen. So I think we can find a lot in that, and I will affirm that yes, we have international politics and international studies, theoretical and Pulantzas stuff.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. This was a very comprehensive theoretical answer and gave me a lot to think about, gave me some homework. So I have to read that book by Polanzas now. And I really think that you are very close to making a very distinctive and important theoretical contribution to the debate in international relations there, presenting Polanzas as an international relations author. So I think that there is really the space for making this argument in theory there and putting it out there in international relations debates. And you are doing that already in other articles, but here you present that together as something that you do for the analysis of Brazilian foreign policy. And I think there is a theoretical argument in its own right there to be made. Now, moving on to Brazilian foreign policy. We just passed through a very dramatic change. Really, like it's radical how Brazilian foreign policy changed in the last 4 months. Right, it is really substantial, and this is really not very common. And I think this poses questions to more structural explanations of foreign policy, because did the Brazilian social classes change that much? So what happened for the Brazilian social classes to admit that level of change in foreign policies from Bolsonaro's government to Lula's government, right? The transition to Bolsonaro's government is not that much of a problem there, because you had the long crisis, you had the government of Temer as a kind of a buffer government that had many elements of a lot of different things. But in the case of Bolsonaro, it was really one international strategy with tones of fascism, and then in the case of Lula, we have a totally different diplomatic strategy. I would agree it's a form of neodevelopmentalism. So how do you see the new foreign policy in Lula's government, and how do you explain that radical change that we are just witnessing now? And then after this question, whoever remains here have the chance to ask other questions. So Tatiana, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Felipe, for this great question. Mm, I would say that, first of all, we need to consider the change international context with the US and European Union pressures, especially on environment, democracy, and human rights. Uh, that have caused some reactions in the Brazilian internal bourgeoisie and also at the associated bourgeoisie. The GDP was not increasing as they wanted to. The foreign direct investment recipient was not the same was as they wished to. So he didn't deliver it what the bourgeoisie wanted to. So what are the Lula's challenges in foreign policy? Looking for the social class. I think for Singa, okay, we can see a new agenda, a new protagonism going to China, to US, but what will be the goal? What will be the strategy on that? And what are the challenges? Looking for the Brazilian bourgeoisie, internal bourgeoisie. I think that the Brazilian internal bourgeoisie, with the associated bourgeoisie, appear to have a consensus on the OECD membership application. And it's based on the project of the neoliberalism reforms and the reduction of the Brazilian cost, an old agenda of the Brazilian bourgeoisie. There is an illusion that with the diminish of the labor costs, the Brazilian industry can be more competitive. They deny the dependence aspect of their existence. It's the political ideological fragility of the internal bourgeoisie. Look into the Mercosur agreement. There is a conflict inside the internal bourgeoisie. So if we are going, you have this first issue, that is OECD, and how they will manage, the government will manage with the neoliberal reform that is expected to have the assessment. It's a contradiction. And the second point is the Mercosur-European agreement. We can see a conflict inside the internal bourgeoisie, a machinery and equipment and the partners association, and also the automobile association do not support the Mercosur European Union agreement. It is seen as a threat to the national production and the regional market, especially Mercosur. But the National Industry Confederation and the São Paulo State Industry Federation support the agreement, looking for European investments in the Brazilian insertion in global value chains. It can be a contradiction for Brazilian internal bourgeoisie existence. The agribusiness supports Mercosur agreement, looking to access the European market instead of quotas and restriction has been retained. Regarding Mercosur, the Bolsonaro's government tried to make a reform of the common external tariff. And the industrial and agribusiness did not follow the government proposal. The position was just to reduce in 20 instead of 50 of the tariff. So they still show they need the regional protection against foreign products. And this could be seen that the idea of the creation of a Mercosur currency or Argentinian Brazil currency could be a good plan to maintain and to strengthen the Mercosur market. The agribusiness sector has also been divided due to the environmental issues. The soil sector, the productive one, benefited from the deforestation policy, supported Bolsonaro policy. But the agro industry, mainly the multinational traders, was affected by this and has been sensitive to the European Union and US pressures against Brazilian environmental commitment and started to defend the environmental and social governance strategies. So I think that in this scenario of conflict and instability, escalated by the effects of the COVID pandemic, Lula won the election, but the neo-fascist movement keeps strong, and the neoliberal front is still on power. Lula government had the challenge to enforce the internal bourgeoisie and change Brazilian international insertion and position in the international arena. And it needs to be based on inequalities, labor, and sustainability policy. I think that's the challenge. That's what is in the table in the Brazilian political scene now.
Okay, Tatiana, thank you so much. And I have to say that we don't have a big audience today. We have 10 people, but we have a very highly qualified audience here. So I recognize many names. So thank you for joining us. And I see questions from Tomas, from Pedro. So I think we can take the two questions at the same time, and then Tatiana can try and answer both of them in order. So starting with Thomas. Thomas, floor is yours.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for the very inspiring presentation, Tatiana. I have a question based on your choice about the class fractions in Brazil, because Polanca's work is mostly related to class fractionalism in Europe, post-World War II Europe. And the situation in Brazil, the class formation in Brazil, is very different in time and space. Brazil is not is a semi-peripheral country, not like Europe, and things has changed a lot here in terms of class formation since the 1970s to nowadays. And as you were saying, Poulantzas died before the big debate on globalization and even financialization. But you just mentioned that he would argue that new class fractions would emerge by this, not necessarily challenging the role of the state. So why you didn't consider conceptualizing new class fractions that would be more integrated to debates about globalization and financialization? My question is driven mostly by the curiosity about what in Brazil, what is the really big difference between associated bourgeoisie and internal bourgeoisie? Because internal bourgeoisie in Europe in 1970s was something very different from Brazil. So is the internal bourgeoisie really a class fraction in Brazil? Does it has really productive oriented interests that are in some sense close to what we would call a national bourgeoisie? Isn't it to say that associated and internal bourgeoisie in Brazil, they kind of mingle and they have contradictions, but they can be considered as a subordinated, highly financialized and highly dependent class fraction, class fraction highly dependent on foreign capital?
Felipe, we're not hearing you.
Oh, okay. So that's a great question, Tomasz, and I think it really gives enough for Tatiana to talk. So unless Pedro has a question that is related to that one, I'm tempted to just yeah. Okay, so yeah. So Pedro will have a different question. So let's just go back to Tatiana because I think we have enough here to answer.
That's a good question. I would say that's not the first time that I am asked about it. So I'm used to it. It's a good one. First of all, Poulantzas developed or was thinking about Europe and how can we use it to think peripheral or social, semi-peripheral country as Brazil. I would say that, first of all, I'm not the first one to use this. We have, I call a school here in Brazil, Campinas School, which use this framework to analyze Brazilian politics. I think especially Poulantzas pointed something important to analyze Brazilian development, capitalism development, that is to go against the Communist Party, the Third International and the Communist Party sentiment, especially the idea that Brazilian productive sector will be a national bourgeoisie. That's the idea. So I think concepts in theory for analyze capitalism can be used in different times in space. It's not a real problem. And especially that for Poulantzas, fraction is not sector. So we can have banks, the national banks in Brazil, Bradesco and Itaú, they claim state protection. If they claim state protection, they have this conflict with the foreign capital. They do not want more banks because we have difference. The investor banks, the security and financial, and this agencies, the banks for or the Brazilian politics and creditors and so on. So if they ask the Brazilian state protection, if they claim for it, they could see as internal bourgeoisie. I think Poulantzas could, the importance is not just where is it or, but how it's the political ideology of this fraction. As you can see, it's connected. It's dependent on financial and internationalization process. But at the same time, it will claim, oh no, please state, I need to survive, I need to compete. But don't broke with them. Don't broke with the foreign capital. So that's the intermediary fraction as Poulantzas pointed. I think it's important. So first, to deny the idea of national bourgeoisie existence, that we can affirm that, oh, Brazilian does not have a national revolution process, a national bourgeoisie leading it. That's why we can explain the many political crises during the development moment between 30 and 64. It was, I think, 7 political crises and so on. And nowadays, the coup d'etat against Dilma. So I think we can think about it. To use this, the idea of the chance in financialization, neoliberalism process, I think it is important to have some developments and advance, so we can go beyond Poulantzas to think about it. But we are talking that the financialization sector could be inside the associated bourgeoisie, because it will be, the behavior will be so similar as the Purchasian bourgeoisie. So they are dependent on the national market, and they will reproduce the imperialist interests inside the national social formation. So it's the linkage. I have some hypotheses when I am thinking and debating with the contemporary imperialism debate against Robinson thesis, the capitalist transnational classes, and so on. I think we can, it's important to think the fractions in the international arena. And yes, for financial capital, maybe we could see a fraction more linked, but if you go through the and open it, it will have a national owner. So, and Poulantzas pointed one important thing for the international current politics, that is the difference between the judiciary property and the economic property. So thinking about the big companies and then finance capital, how we can work when you think about the subsidiaries and the investors and so on, the managers. Poulantzas had a development about the new petit bourgeoisie, that's the managers and so on. So I think he has some pointed, but we need to go further. We need to go and advance it. It's important. But to think about Brazil associated in internal bourgeoisie conflicts or contradiction that you also asked me for, they are not together. That was the main contradiction for the coup d'etat in Brazil. We could see today for Lula's presidents, the Fiesp, CNI, and many entrepreneurs associations claiming for the interest rate for the National Development Bank strategy. And it's a big contradiction with the financial capital. So we have this, the neoliberal program and the neodevelopmentalist, that's just a reform, but the big point is the interest rate and the national bank strategy and other rule of the state to protect the national market and national purchase and so on. And this is now in the same. We can see in every document and position from them. So I think it's still available and it is still there. You can see. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Tatiana. So now we have a question from Pedro. And if anyone else wants to ask questions, please raise your hand. But now, Pedro, floor is yours.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Tatiana. And congratulations for the book. I have read some chapters of the previous version in Portuguese. It is, as Felipe said, perhaps the main account of Brazilian foreign policy in the Marxist camp in the past 20 years. So congratulations for your brilliant work. It's very empirically rich as well. And I want my question to draw from that wealth of empirical knowledge that you bring from your acquaintance with the different strategies of accumulation of the Brazilian bourgeoisie and its manifestations in terms of foreign policy, especially in what is perhaps the biggest news in Brazilian foreign policy recently, which is Lula's visit to China and the plans that were announced of coming up with new trade strategies to not rely on the dollar, right? How do you see this struggle against the dollar standard within the different strategies within these divisions of the Brazilian bourgeoisie and their foreign policy plans? I mean, it's not the first time we've seen those. It's a matter of whether these attempts to struggle against dollar standard are significant or not. And how do you see that within the Brazilian ruling classes?
Thank you, Pedro. Very timely question. We have another question from Rafael. So let me ask Tatiana, do you want to take another question or you want to answer that one first?
Yes, please. No, we can, please.
Okay. So Rafael, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for hosting this, Felipe and Tatiana, for giving us such a brilliant talk. My question is more theoretical. Robert Cox, in his seminal article, Social Forces, I never remember the whole name, title of the article, but I believe you probably know which one I'm referring to.
Is the triangle article?
Yes, yes. 2 triangles in it. Yeah. He poses a Sorry, did I cut out? Okay. So he poses this differentiation between problem-solving theories and critical theories, right? And he says that even within Marxism, there are some that follow what he says is this historical materialism, and another type of Marxism that would be problem-solving, that has a system maintenance bias that he calls structuralist Marxism, right? So my question to you is, if you agree with that reading, I think you probably don't. I think you probably do consider Poulantzas to be critical theory. But I wanted to see your response to him. You know, I don't know how close of a reading you have of Cox, and Cox also doesn't develop this critique of Poulantzas thoroughly. It's just one section of his book, but I would like to hear a response if you have one.
So 2 very different questions.
Yes.
You can take them in turn. Tatiana.
Okay. Pedro, I do not have time really to think about this, but let's try. I think the first thing is not to broke with dollar pattern. What they are saying is just to use other currencies for the commercial issue. So for the commercial relations between Brazil and China, or Brazil and Argentina. It's important, but it's not broke with hegemony, and especially in Brazil, it's not broke with all the pressures for the interest rates and how the financial capital demand the Brazilian politics nowadays. So I think it's important for the internal bourgeoisie. It could enforce them. It could have a good way, but it can be just a contradiction, a punctual contradiction with the imperialism, and not an anti-imperialist politics. It will not catch up Brazilian development and the the dependence situation. That's what I think. It's not so, it's more symbolic and have materials gains, but it's more symbolic. Rafael, during my master, when I was proposing to use Pilantes for international relations, I was really pressed to wrote about Cox. What are the difference? And so I have a chapter in an article published about it. I can say that Brazilian thinkers that are very Coxian didn't like my critical and the difference that I pointed with Cox. But I read some books. Actually, I think Alfredo Sade has a chapter in one of these books. I have two books that is some criticals for Gramscian thought of international relations, and he pointed with other author that Cox make a mix in the institutional and Marxism thought. So he used this, especially for the triangle, as you can see how they manage it and so on. But my point with Cox's statement is, first of all, not just in this special article that you mentioned, the first one, he's present the concept of hegemony to think international relations, and the Marxism is a point. That's good. That's a very important step for international political economy and for all these studies. But when you go further for other articles, Cox articles, you say about social forces, not social classes, the transformation of the state. Actually, he brings the word system theory to the IPA and think about a Gramsci framework. But my point is, when he analyzes that the fragility that he present in the international, in the theoretical perspective, with the triangle and so on, we can see that how it will end in some theses, like the internationalization of the state that is present in many Gramscian theories of IR. As you can see, if you have internationalization of production, then you have the internationalization of the state. Cox will say, we have elites consensus. Elites is not Marxism, sorry. If you have someone and if you go to analyze just a network and say, we have a national president bank and a national manager of a big company, then you can have him as in a ministry, then we have an elite consensus. Okay, it's Bourgeoisie, it's not Marx. No. Who is the property, who has the accumulation process, who has the domain of the society. It's not this. These are the managers. I think this is the new petit bourgeoisie. This is not the big bourgeoisie international and so on. So I think I have really difference for Pilantes. If we go to compare the idea of the crisis of the hegemony, U.S. hegemony. Pilantes does not accept this thesis in the 70s, but until today we can. He would say the crisis of hegemony is not the crisis of capital. It needs to be the crisis of the imperialist chain. So imperialist chain will have the role international capitalist system to analyze and to think if it's really changing or not, how the weak links, the weak nodes will be working on that and so on. So probably also does not not accepting the hegemony, the US hegemony crisis could be another assessment on that. So many differences we have, but especially on concrete analysis, I could say, not the idea and what will be the contradiction with the problem solving. That's other problem that you asked me, how I are thinking about the structural uh, structural problems and structural approach, the difference between realism and Marxism in that. I think it's important because sometimes you can see people saying, oh, but Pulantzas is structuralist and neorealists are also, but come on, what are the difference inside it? To be Marxist structuralist is not deny the theory of the history and the possibility of big transformations and trends and the class interests. It's very different when you have a concept of the structuralism of the Cartesian, the positivism thinking. So that's it. I don't know if I could reply you correctly. But I can share with you my writing on this.
Yeah, that was great. That was great, and please do share your references with us. It's always yeah, insightful. I was going to call it a day, but we have another question from Italu. So Italu, go ahead.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Tatiana, congrats on the book launch. Okay, I have a question is probably a bit different from the one that came before because I'm not really a Marxist. I don't use a Marxist approach for foreign policy analysis. So I would like Tatiana to compare a little bit and maybe present what are the main differences of her analysis from mainstream foreign policy analysis in Brazil, especially on the view that foreign policy is also as any other public policy. So in your analysis, Tatiana usually makes statements that these fractions work in a very similar way with political economy, social politics, social policies, sorry, and foreign policy. And mainstream also makes a similar statement that foreign policy is just like any other policy. So, I mean, what are the main differences? Well, just enlighten me. So I would like to know and see how much at the end we can match your analysis with mainstream analysis here in Brazil. I guess that's it. I hope I made myself.
Yes, Italo, that's a great question. And if I may, Tatiana, I wanted to add something to that question, so a bit on the same vein. So foreign policy analysis is a very weird field, right? It is international relations and it's not international relations at the same time. So I really wonder, how do you see the field of foreign policy analysis, particularly in Brazil? So what are the main ideas there? What are the problems with the field? I find most foreign policy analysis in Brazil very disappointing for being too close to power, to reproducing the official discourse a bit too much. But perhaps there is a new generation there in Brazil writing about foreign policy in much more critical ways. So it would be interesting if you could give us a little bit of an overview of the field of foreign policy analysis. What are the debates then? How do you situate yourself within this field?
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Italo, for attending this. He's talking from Palmas, Tocantins, so we have a Brazilian insertion here. First of all, I will consider my debate inside this area, the foreign policy analysis. I think we have three assessments. to be against realist concept of state as a monolithic actor, the national interest as something static, based on power, sovereign, and so on, and the difference between foreign policy and domestic theory. So it's just to analyze it connected, the links between foreign policy and domestic theory. So in general terms, I think I am in this area, but the difference is to present the Marxist approach for this. It's a difference. We can see, I think I'm closer from the two-level game theory, if you can see, if you can talk about it. Like, okay, we have an international contest, then we have the national level and the groups debate. The difference is that for them, we have groups, interest groups. So we don't have conflicts, we don't have contradictions, we don't have dominated relations. So we can use sometimes talking about Brazilian, they can use trade unions and entrepreneurs as the same in the same level of the analysis of these forces, correlations, and so on. That's the first difference. Sometimes also the two-level games analysis focus just into one negotiation. Let's analyze Brazil, Mercosur, inside Mercosur, or just analyze Mercosur agreement and the interest groups in Brazil and how they are in this situation. That's the first contradiction. Other thing is foreign policy is a public policy, okay, but how they will manage to it. I'm saying more about the Rio de Janeiro, Maria Regina, Carlos Milani, and these colleagues. I think I can say more about these works. That is a very great works. I think they have a school there with great developments. So the last chapter that I read for Maria Regina, she presents the neo-realist approach to the Dilma's crisis. It's a very interesting chapter, published at IPEA Books. I can share with you if you were interested to. And she said, oh, in this crisis and at the 64 crisis, we have the same behavior with a break in the elite's consensus. So she will focus the idea that we have a consensus between entrepreneurs, journalists, media, and the political parties. So we have the coalition inside the legislative, that it was broke, and also maybe the confidence or the way that the elites were seeing Lula. They decided to get out of that coalition, and this broke. And she said many times it was for her the autonomy goal. She was criticizing the idea of autonomy as a presence in the whole history of Brazilian foreign policy. And she said, just 2 times we have the autonomy goal, with the independent foreign policy before the coup d'etat in 64, and with Lula's and Dilma's, not all the time, so it's not a presence. And she said, and in just these 2 times, we had these coalitions being broken, this consensus of elites. So that's my difference. It's not a consensus because, and this is, and I am not working with the idea of elites, working with social class. That's not just a name, because she's saying that we have political parties, we have media, and we have entrepreneurs in the same situation. And when I manage it in the Marxist point of view, it's not the same. And also, it could rely in the idea of a pact or existence of an alliance, that it's not unstable as the front, the idea of front that I'm using. The idea of front that you explain the Brazilian political crisis, because the internal bourgeoisie, I could say, it needs state protection, but at the same time, when we have Vargas government, when we have Lula's government, they does not accept all the time. Maybe as Felipe pointed in his thesis, when we have international situation different, that they will not have the same gain, they will say, oh, I don't want more. It's not a pact. Probably it could be go deeper from it. I think we have many debates to do on that, on the Brazilian foreign policy analysis in Brazil. I could say it's been a very strong area, having refreshed studies that we could, it's important to debate and to highlight. Your studies too, that you mix it, quantitative and qualitative methodologies. I think it's important to highlight and to have this debates.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Yes, and I really agree that it's really a booming field now. I remember 10 years ago when I was back in Brazil doing my master's at the Instituto Rio Branco, it was so boring. It was really like a School of Brasilia all the time. And now we have really booming different perspectives, and yeah, so it's quite interesting to see that. I do think though that a lot of the foreign policy analysis in Brazil needs to be more explicit about that theory, and your work has this amazing quality of like doing theory and foreign policy analysis at the same time. So congratulations for that. And I think this is the end of our talk today. I don't see any more questions. Tatiana, thank you so much for taking the time, and we'll make this available online. So thank you, everyone. I think we can leave it here. Can we leave it here, Tatiana? Do you have any final words to say?
Oh, thank you so much for organizing this. It was a very great moment to be with you. And I hope we have more moments like that, and we could go deeper with this analysis and this area in Brazil and in UK. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Also have
See you next time.
colleagues. Bye.